Welcome everyone to Chapter 5, Age of New Immigrants. This chapter is going to be detailing a lot of the experiences that many folks were seeing coming from Europe to the United States. Typically, from the chapter, it was going over anything from the Balkans, Greeks, Serbians, Macedonians, Armenians, etc. However, today we are going to be focusing on a couple groups specifically, with the understanding that a lot of similarities are going to cross over to the others. Namely, today we are going to be going over Italian Americans, and at the very tail end, looking at the diaspora groups. We're going to be looking at the Armenians as a focus. Now, some topics just generally to consider as we're going through the lecture. Some general reasons for leaving Europe at the time and heading towards America, right, or the United States. How these experiences, were occurring as they're going through Ellis Island, through the East Coast. And discussion that we're going to have about old world meeting new world, right? How these communities are forming. How much of the old world culture do they still carry with them? How much Americanization are they receiving and incorporating into their lives? Or is it something in between? And of course, discussing the diaspora groups. What does it mean to be considered a diaspora group? And why and how they found themselves coming to the United States. So, Western Europe and the rest of Europe in general as well, for similar reasons. So Western Europe at this time, specifically, we're looking at the Iberian Peninsula or Spain and Portugal. Beautiful places, definitely on the bucket list for travels one day. They at that time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the turn of the century, they were seeing a huge amount of economic and agricultural hardships. From the economic side, they were seeing low wages. They were seeing much more competition through textile industries. Textile industries are industries or jobs that you are performing with your hands, right? You are making handmade products. And now, because of the Industrial Revolution, machinery is coming in and essentially just wiping off jobs like never before. Textile industries are taking a nosedive. And just living there just became increasingly, a much more difficult pill to swallow. Work was not as plentiful as before. Wages were dropping. So people were really kind of feeling the pinch. Which, perhaps we can make comparisons to the modern day. So if the Industrial Revolution was the huge issue during the late 1800s and early 1900s, the technological revolution in the last 10 to 20 years is doing the equivalent of that, right? Phasing out a lot of these old jobs in favor of machinery, the internet, etc. Agriculturally, many were suffering because at that moment in time, the climate was turning a bit dry and arid. So we are getting archaeological samples from the soil from the approximately the 1900 years, and the soil was going through major droughts. So rains were not good. The farmland was not producing as much as it should, and so large amounts of devastation in terms of food production. And if you're living in, let's say, the Iberian Peninsula, either Spain or Portugal, and you are a farmer, right, or something closely linked to agriculture, that is essentially death, right? You need to have work. You need to be able to toil the land. And so as a result of all of this economic and agricultural issues, we ended up seeing approximately 140 plus thousand Spaniards and others, right, leaving Iberia for America. And so once again, the huge waves of immigration are unfolding through what is called the Great Migration. The entirety of the 1800s is nicknamed the Great Migration for the United States. It is nicknamed this because we see millions upon millions of people flooding the U.S. because for whatever reason, in their homelands, things are not going too great, whether it's war, poverty, economic, agricultural devastation, what have you, right? If you're reading your books or pamphlets and you're saying, wow, America sounds great, it has plentiful amounts of jobs, right? And they're expanding, right? We should probably go there and have a better life for ourselves. And a lot of these individuals, as they finally mustered up the courage to pack up their belongings, take their family members and their children, buy enough money for a boat or a ferry and finally go across the Atlantic, they ended up coming through Ellis Island, usually. Not exclusively, but typically through Ellis Island in New York. And so this was a huge immigration station. And so hundreds of thousands were passing through this specific location for more than 60 years. And so, this was a station where people would be, showing their paperwork, making sure everything's okay. Also, doctors on hand, right, to kind of look under your eyes, check under your tongue, make sure you don't have measles or something crazy or ridiculous like that. And so, and also, right, signing your name in the ledger, in the booklet. So many folks can actually go back to, if you have European ancestry, they can go back through the records within Ellis Island and find their great grandfather or something, right, kind of signing in, which is pretty cool to see. And so these kind of sites would be common. Folks packing, right, just like one suitcase, right, each, and just saying, honey, kids, we're leaving, right? We need a better life for ourselves. I saved up enough money. I spoke with the local fisherman or the port master, right? And I got us a ship, and we are going to be going and trying to make it in America. No guarantees, but, we were going to try our best. And, these ships would be absolutely packed, right? Because everybody at this time wanted to come. And so, sites such as these, thankfully, we don't have a Titanic situation in our hands here, but, thankfully, these ships, even though they were extremely packed, most of them made it across safely. But as you can see, this is not a luxury cruise, right? Folks are here because they want to, they want to just make it across. And finally, once you found yourself on Ellis Island, you would be going through these various check stations. Very similar to how if you're flying abroad, you come through the airport and you have the TSA, and you got to go through all of the various screenings, right? What are you doing here? Business or pleasure? Have you been in contact with deadly mosquitoes, right? The typical questions. And finally, after you made it past Ellis Island, you could stare across the Hudson towards New York, right? And kind of just imagine a new life for yourself. And so can't imagine how many hundreds of thousands of families, if not millions, right? Were staring across and just, saying, thank God we are finally here. And so, anyone from Italian to Irish to Spanish, French, German, whatever, right? We had all different types of Europeans and folks coming through Ellis Island, or even anywhere from that side of the world, right? Anybody from the Middle East, anyone from Northern Africa, right? Whoever could make it here. And so as we're going to be looking through our other sections, from different peoples from around Europe or Eastern Europe or North Africa or the Middle East or wherever, most of them were having these kind of similar experiences, right? And Ellis Island invited them all. This is an immigrant statue, right? A monument for the immigrant family trying to make it and trudge their way towards America for a better life. And this was actually funded by an Italian-American family. And so the Italian-Americans, as we're going to see in this, chapter, are going to be, very important, both in terms of, this kind of era, but also because New York has a very large and popular and solidified Italian-American community, right? That's just, how it is. And they've become famous for it. Even as far as us all kind of seeing these, famous TV shows or movies or Robert De Niro or anything, right? And that kind of like Italian-American mobster, show, right, or something to that effect. They've kind of, right, really kind of solidified themselves into the, national culture, right, in the lexicon. And so, it is, worthy, right, and, academically correct for us to study them, right, and to kind of see what their experiences were like. Now, if you have a couple of minutes of time, it's not too terribly long, but a short little clip of what was Ellis Island and what the immigration experience was coming through the east coast of the United States. So if you have a couple of minutes of time, definitely give it a watch. It would be worth your while. Now, Italian immigrants. So we do have to kind of differentiate them between two sectors, the North and the South. Cue anybody who likes Game of Thrones, right? Anybody from the North, right? Or the South, right? With the Lannisters. So I guess you can divide yourselves amongst the Starks or the Lannisters, however you see fit. But going back to, the olden days, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, Italy actually was pretty split up between two geographical locations, the North and the South. The North tended to be much more industrial, more business, more factories, more textile work was up there. And so most, not all, but most of the doctors, businesses, the port cities with traders coming in with, vast quantities of money, carpenters, glass blowers, etc., right? All of these really good professions that later on the United States would want, right? So if you're coming to the US and they're like, what kind of special skills do you have? They could say, I'm a carpenter. And they'll be like, great, we need carpenters. We're building cities right now, right? Or you can say, I'm a lawyer. Fantastic. We need lawyers here too, etc. So, they were at a more advantageous position because the North was, a bit more trained. Now, there is the kind of skin racial element there too. So as folks are coming from Italy, the Italians in the North were a bit lighter skinned. And so that allowed for a better kind of transition, right, into American Protestant life. And so they were seen, from the American perspective as being lighter skinned, more educated, and typically a very adjustable type of people, because their life was, because the North was very trade happy, right? Kind of cornerstones of the Silk Road and all of this trade and money crisscrossing and culture crisscrossing. They were seen as a very adjustable people, right? Or essentially you can adapt pretty quickly and well. So many actually liked the folks coming from the North. As far as south of Italy goes, southern Italy was more agricultural. It's closer to the equator. It has much more fertile lands. And so the south of Italy, and some of this stereotypes still exist today in Italy, where the South is looked upon as more or less educated, darker skinned, and did not have as many, of these juicy professions that the United States would want. And so these folks were moving because of various, problems or traumas within Italy. They were, either, hungry because of famine, or there was, a bunch of social unrest in the middle to southern of France and they wanted to leave. Plus, they were hearing a bunch of the American propaganda of, please come to the US, there's work aplenty for you. And so, they definitely made it, a priority to come. However, they were, a little bit less of an adjustable people, right? Because when you are in a more agricultural type of environment, it does not really allow for a lot of culture and different peoples to migrate throughout the territory. Even look at us modernly. Los Angeles, for instance, is a bustling metropolitan city. You drive a few hours inland near Palmdale or somewhere close to there, right? A city where the large cities like Los Angeles are just 3-4 hours away. You're in the middle of nowhere on a farm. You get less interaction with folks. So they were much more into the preserving of the heritage culture, right? Being more pro-family, pro-culture, keeping your history alive. And so, these are the type of differences that we could see, right, between northern and southern, right, Italians during this time period. And so, yeah. Oh, and also, many of the southern Italians and some of the north as well, because they were very pro-family oriented, as all of us are. Obviously, as soon as they hit the shores of the U.S. and make it big and start to make money, they start sending money back home, as many of you probably might do, right? If you have family abroad or cousins or wherever back in the mother country, wherever that is, they started to send hundreds of millions of dollars back home from all of the wages. That is because common sense. If the U.S. dollar is super strong and back home the economy is kind of tilting on the edge of bankruptcy or destruction, the U.S. dollar is very strong, so you can send them like X amount of dollars per month, and for you, it's not that big of a hit. For them, it makes a huge difference. And so the example of, just the North, right? The Northern Italians, they had all of these professions, right? Such as smelting and working with, warehouses and factories and heavy machinery. So as the United States in the 1800s, right, especially the late 1800s with the Gilded Age, the Second Industrial Revolution, cities being built, railroads, bridges, steel columns everywhere. Those are very favored professions because they need skilled workers to do these type of jobs and literally build America. Versus the South. The South, right, did not have as good or easy of a time making it through, let's say, the kind of quote-unquote favored professions as they were coming to the United States, but they had a lot of other strengths as well. They were masters of agriculture and winery, and they were very pro-family oriented. And so we're going to see how some of that is going to potentially influence, some of the early history of Italian Americans in New York, and how some of it ended up, kind of seeping into modern culture or our understanding of Italian Americans through movies and such. The best example probably would be a lot of these movies would have, let's say, Sicilians, right? People from Sicily being very kind of like gangsterish, and part of the mafia or whatnot. That has these early stereotypes coming from these type of differentiations, right? Where the Southerners were seen more like, darker skin, kind of like from the country, from the hood, and then they come and just want to hustle and make money, right? That kind of mentality. So it's interesting to see how the history actually interacts with the stereotypes and how we kind of see, the world today. So by the early 1900s, right, we start getting tens of thousands and more and hundreds of thousands of Italians coming over as they start to realize that the United States is truly, for them, an economic paradise. And they start to write back home many letters, and word spreads that America is good. We need to start migrating over there. And so the East Coast and other like interior spots of the U.S. start to grow tremendously with Italian communities. New York, Boston, Norfolk, Chicago, etc. And as these communities would start to grow, they definitely started to thrive. Many found work wherever they could, either pushing carts or being, organ grinders or working at the food markets. Let's say doing something for the festival or for the city, right? Making props, whatever they wanted to do or whatever their skill set allowed. Others, if they were more fortunate, they were having those industrial skills we were talking about. So they were working at the mills, the wharfs, the mines, the factories, especially with metallurgy, smelting, right? Hot iron all the time. If they had more business savvy skills, or they were, let's say, closer towards being an attorney, they would open up their own businesses, right? Restaurants, pharmacies, etc. So as you can see, right, plenty of differentiation in the sectors. And so we have a community really starting to form. And as the community starts to form, the age-old value of la familia, right? Or essentially having security within your family and extended friends, neighbors, etc., because you all know that you are from each other's bloodlines. So what la familia is an understanding that you are all, let's say, Italian, and you're coming over to the United States to live here, to work here, to build a community. And there is a certain level of distrust of other community members, right? There's a distrust of the Irish, of the Germans, right? Of the African Americans and everyone else, right? They're in a new country, a new environment. However, oh, you're my guy, you're Italian, right? We're part of the same bloodline, right? You're the second cousin of my mother's sister's brother, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like that entire kind of notion of bloodline, right? The family ties in somehow. And so you and I are not just tied together because we're friends, but literally by blood, right? We are family by blood. And so that was a very important thing for them to maintain as the years went by. Now, here's a couple of wonderful videos, right, on this kind of issue of immigration and La Familia. The video on the left, much shorter. It's around 3 to 4 minutes, I believe. And it is a nice little snapshot of some of the businesses that they're creating, some of the grocery stores and stands, right, to make money for their families, and that kind of close-knit relationship. On the right-hand side, if you are more interested and inclined, it is a part of a documentary series. So that's around 45 minutes long, and goes a bit more in detail, for sure, on La Familia and these Italian-American communities that are growing and fostering in New York, the East Coast, and other big cities like Chicago. And so sites like these would be very normal. If you are of Italian origin, or even anyone else of, let's say, the Mediterranean or Greek or even Middle Eastern, right? If you're Lebanese or from Jordan or anywhere from those areas, right? Large family gatherings are very important, right? You'll have, large feasts, right? Almost every other weekend or every weekend. And so the family unit is extremely close. People are, always helping each other, supporting each other, but always keeping each other accountable, right? So if your aunt or uncle hears that you're up to no good, they're going to hear about it, right? And they're going to get involved, right? Or God forbid, if you bring home, let's say ladies, if you bring home a young boy, right? Your brothers, your cousins, your Uncle Vinny's, your aunts, Maria, they're all going to get involved and say, who's this young man, right? The family is stronger together, but that has pros and cons, right, alongside of it. And so it's definitely good, interesting times. And so, of course, we start getting also all of these various businesses that are growing and developing as they are kind of getting settled. And this happens, with almost any group, right, that we see coming to the United States. It is, the entrepreneurial spirit of starting your own business and trying to make it in the United States. And so, even here in Los Angeles, a lot of times we'll be seeing new families come over. And, when you come over, you have to do whatever you can, right, in order to make money and survive. Your parents could be working lower end jobs, right, to make do. And then eventually the idea is work hard, save enough money, let's say open up a business or a restaurant, right? Kind of move your way up. And then send your kids to get an education, right? And so hopefully by the time your children are your age when you came to the United States, they will have an even better life, and so on and so forth. And so, right, that whole mentality of coming here, working hard, attaining the American dream is definitely alive and well. And so we start to see plenty of Italian American grocery stores, right, and shops, kind of pop out all over the place. Sites like this would be popular as well because, a lot of these stores were family owned, right? This is not your typical Amazon, where you can be as antisocial as possible, and with a few, clicks of the thumb on your phone, you just order a bunch of stuff and it gets shipped to you. These are family-owned businesses. You come in, the store owner, right? Their family members and the children that work there, and sweeping up and taking care of the business, right? You form business relationships, right? Everybody on a first name basis. Everyone in the community knows each other's names. And here we see the grandmothers, right? And the family units, right? They're all kind of sitting outside and working, right? It's the families helping each other out. So very, very close-knit ties. This is a great scene. For nobody that has seen it, or if you have seen it, then kudos to you. But from The Godfather 2. The Godfather series is amazing on many levels, right? Definitely a fantastic trilogy to watch if you have never seen it before. But this is at the very beginning of The Godfather 2, the second movie in the trilogy, where young Vito Andolini Corleone, he ends up as a very young boy because he had to run away from Italy, Sicily, I believe, right? The whole Sicily mentality. And so he had to run away because his family members were murdered and, some crazy stuff happened. And so he ends up as a very young boy on one of those large ships and gets sailed across the Atlantic, comes to Ellis Island, and they're doing all those things that we were discussing, right? Put your tongue down. Let me see that, right? Let me look at your eyes. What's your name? How old are you? Are you sick? Etc. And so they're kind of testing them out, and that was his first entry into the United States. But what I love is they have a scene, like a few seconds here, right? As he's on the ship, kind of coming closer and closer to New York, that typical sight of the American dream kind of unfolds itself, right? So you are on the ship and you're smelling the sea air, right? And you're packed like sardines, right? With all these other immigrants on the ship. They could be Italians and folks from all around Europe, right? Or the world, right? Because everyone is trying to get to America. And so this young Italian boy, he's hearing Spanish, German, French, English. He could be hearing, Arabic if there's a family from northern Africa or whatever. And then you all at once see the beautiful sight of the Statue of Liberty, right? On the horizon, just as you're passing by. And so many stories like that from the historical record that we can get of folks writing about that moment, right? Writing about the hardships that they had to endure, all the money that they had to scramble by, right, from the home country just to buy a ticket to get to the U.S. And finally, they saw the famous Statue of Liberty. And then, that to them was, oh, we're finally here. We can start our new life, right, and start the new chapter, and hopefully for a more safer and more prosperous life. Now, this is kind of getting into the more detailed version of what I was talking about earlier, where Italian Americans could be a little bit distrustful of others, especially if they are not part of your own family. And so this is caused because of, right, like I always keep saying, right, like a broken record, the historical past influences the cultural present. If anyone remembers that phrase of mine, definitely write it on any of my exams. I will give you brownie points for that. But, the Italians are distrustful because of centuries of invasions, and this is specifically for the South. Centuries of invasion. The northern Italians were discriminatory against them. The signores, the upperclassmen, were making fun of these Southerners because there's like, oh, you poor peasants, you farmers, right? And so the Southerners, a lot of times, right, these Southern Italians on the boot of Italy or Sicily even, they felt like they were just kind of abandoned, right? No one really liked them. They were the butt of the joke. And even the heralded Catholic Church of theirs, right, that they loved and they worshipped, and many, were, living a good Catholic life and worshiping the Pope and everything they said. Even the church was a bit suspect with their relationship with them because, the church was a huge landowner in Italy, right? Because the church, makes money. And so they were, kind of ambivalent about the church as well, because they were leaving a lot of them high and dry. And so, they were just, as soon as they came to America, right, that kind of distrustful nature, and keeping your heart instead of on your sleeve, right, kind of close to you, it, kind of got retained, definitely. Now, speaking of religion, they did bring forth, right, their old culture in the sense of religion. If any one of you comes from a Catholic background, whether you are Italian or Central or Southern American, right, you know very well that if you have a grandmother, right, or grandfather or great grandfather, grandmother, they are very religious typically, right? And God forbid if you say something bad against the Holy Mother or the Spirit, you're gonna get, right, the very famous, the grandma takes a slipper off her foot and then, right, just hits you across the head from 20 yards away. And so they brought forth their religion, their worship, and their patron saints with them. And so because of their kind of growing distrust of the Catholic Church, God was now seen as this kind of, more far away religious figure, right? That was looking after them and the Italians and the Italian community on more of a macro level, right? And so, God kind of watches over us Italians, right? But not at the, let's say, individual level. And so at the local villages in Italy, they started to worship individual saints. So, some saints that they would worship, let's say, would be Clientelismo or Molocchio or Festa. And so they had their patron saint that would look after them and the village and each individual person. And so late at night, if you were, let's say, from, if you were from a village that worships, I don't know, let's say a saint called Michael, you would pray to the Saint Michael, right? Because Michael would hear your prayers and help you out and your family, because God is kind of busy with the macro level stuff. So I guess it's like delineating responsibilities down the chain of command. And so the term clientelismo is the use of saints as the intermediaries to God. And so the fact that they have all of these saints that they can speak to and ask for prayers, and that the saint is going to impart those words onto God, hopefully down the road, that is clientelismo, which stems from the root clientele, right? You're the client, they are the patron. It's a patron-client relationship. Molocchio deals with the kind of age-old evil eye. If anyone is from the Middle East, you'll know exactly what this is. If anyone is from the Mediterranean or Greek origin or Italian origin, you know exactly what this is. So this kind of evil eye, spirituality or voodoo-ness, where as you go through life, there's sometimes that individual person, and many of you might have felt this too. Sometimes there's that person that, for some reason, right from across the room, they're just kind of like, looking at you funny, right? And then you just, let's say, that night you stub your toe, or you get into a car accident, or the morning after you get a phone call, you didn't get that job offer, whatever. And so the evil eye is always, right, present. And so you must wear, typically, if anyone has seen folks wearing bracelets or necklaces or jewelry with like a blue eye, right? So that is supposed to kind of block that evilness and the evil spirits, so that disaster does not befall you. And of course, they would have a festa or something close to a festival where these Italian Americans would celebrate their patron saint. And so they would have this essentially like a street festival where their patron saint would be built, colored, adorned with fine clothing and materials. And right, they would kind of have a parade to worship, said patron saint. And along with all of this, the famous Italian work ethic came to be, right? That they would pick up any hard work. They would be in blue collar or white collar jobs. and that any money that was made would be spent for the family, because the loyalty for all of these individuals, because of everything we just talked about, is to the family. And so if you're making more money, your number one priority is not to, let's say, better the corporation or the law office that you're working for. Your number one priority is to bring money back home to your family. Buy your mother something nice, make sure your younger brother or sister goes to school and they have a nice jacket so they don't freeze in the winter, right? Things such as this. And so, the close family circles are paramount to folks during this day and age. And, engaging with complete random strangers, that's not really in their MO, right? Because their number one priority right now is just to improve their situation with their family. And so the bustling streets of these major cities, this is for Detroit in 1900, but a very similar site could be made for, let's say, New York or others. And so you would have these large communities, right, with all of these kind of groceries being sold, and newspapers, and people just hanging out on the streets. It's a living, breathing, thriving community, right? Okay, now I'm just tossing Godfather material to all of you, right? This is a good lecture, to be sure. Now, graphic content warning. So if you don't like watching gunshots or blood, stay away from this video. You have been warned. Spoiler alert. But this video is once our main protagonist, right, Corleone, that young boy that we saw on Ferris Island, right, from that video, getting to Ferris Island and kind of making it through customs. By this time, he's already a young adult and trying to make something of himself. And this entire scene is supposed to be him murdering the Don Fanucci, right? This kind of like, essentially like the local boss or mafia owner or pimp or whatever you want to call him, right? He's kind of just like, the big boss, just scalping money from people. And so as the scene progresses, you see this entire large festival, right? The festival for the patron saint. And you can see the entire street is adorned with icons of the patron saint, right? And they're kind of like holding the saint, right, up on high, and have all of these beautiful kind of, ribbons and artworks everywhere. It's legitimately a wonderful, beautiful festival. So try to view it from that perspective, right? All of the scenes of the street and how the street looks and how the community is just thriving, right? And if you want to watch it to the end, he finally gets his, vengeance, I guess, or his murder plot, and then, bam, he gets his target. As you can see some of that over here. But if you don't, once again, want to see that, shield your eyes. But otherwise, it's only a couple minutes long, so enjoy. Now, some Eastern European immigrants. We're going to get a little closer to this later on with our American Jews section, and especially the Russians later on. But as a kind of like early introduction for Eastern European immigrants, many of them were speaking at this point in time some type of Slavic language. Whether you came from Poland or Ukraine or Belarus or any of those type of territories, right? Some type of Slavic language was typically the norm. And during this point in time, right, of the Great Migration, we started to see more than 6 million Eastern Europeans make it to the shore of the United States. A huge number. Many of them were peasants because they were, like the majority of the population. And, they were, definitely acquainted with hard work within industries and big cities and such. But not all of them were especially, let's say, trained, right? Or well qualified for all of that special trained work, like the Northern Italians, for instance. And so many of them did not actually want to initially stay in the United States because they were actually used to, because of the whole peasant status and, life and work was not as good and solid in Eastern Europe, they were actually used to kind of being more migratory. They were used to working somewhere for a few months and then kind of moving to the next city, working a little bit, and then kind of moving on. And so they initially did not have like plans to really stick to the U.S., but over time they were seeing that the economic prosperity here was better than, you know, in Europe, and they're like, okay, well, this is pretty good. We're going to stay. And so many of them were sticking in the big cities, and you know, they found it comforting because at that point in time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, if you're going to, let's say, these big cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, etc., like it sounds like the old world. You're hearing Italian, French, German, Slavic languages, Armenian, Arabic, whatever, right? All these kind of like languages here and there you're kind of hearing. And so, you know, it truly is like the new world, but with a little like ethnic twist from the old world. And they're, of course, bringing forth their religious views as well. Either they were Eastern Orthodox, or let's say Roman Catholic as well. And the further east you go, the more Eastern Orthodox you are. Typically, the closer you are to Italy and the Vatican and the Pope, typically the more Roman Catholic you will be. And out of all of these kind of Eastern folks, I want to focus more on the Armenians, because in the book, you know, they give forth analysis and some discussions on the Greeks, Assyrians, Armenians, and the Romanians and others, but many of them had very similar experiences in the area because of one notable fact. That region of the world, the Balkans, a lot of the kind of Mediterranean part of the migrations were affected by the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so we'll have a discussion on the Ottoman Empire, how it crumbled, and what kind of repercussions were there, and detailing a major kind of event that happened in 1914 as well. So this is what it is known as the Diaspora Immigrants. What are diaspora? So diaspora are, and there's three main diaspora cultures and ethnicities: the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews of the world. And so they are called diaspora because their people are interspersed throughout the world. And so you can go to almost any country or continent and find, let's say, communities of Greeks, right? Or Jewish communities or Armenian communities. And so, you know, they all have kind of a singular sense that they are part of that collective worldwide, although they are broken up geographically, right? Everywhere. And so the Ottoman Empire, which was around for centuries, it was a very large empire in the Middle East, and at its largest, actually I think I have a map here somewhere. There we go. At its very largest extent, historically, it stretched all the way from Algeria in the northern Africa, all the way down to Egypt, on the Saudi Arabia peninsula, to modern Turkey, going into the Caucasus, and up into Europe, right, near Austria, Hungary, Poland, etc., right? It was a huge, vast empire. Now, over time, getting closer and closer to this date, 1914, which was World War I, right? This huge cataclysmic event of World War I. It was going to end up breaking them. But the Ottoman Empire, because some of you might, be hearing other stories of this, so I just want to get the record straight. The Ottoman Empire for centuries was actually an excellent place to live. Empires are typically very multi-ethnic and cultural. They are very inclusive of people and religions and everything else, because the more folks they incorporate into their empire, the stronger that the empire becomes. And so our focus today, the Armenians, and we'll have the Greeks in the discussion as well, they were living within the empire relatively peacefully. And they, were able to be very successful and have businesses and intermarry and do whatever else they needed to do. Because in the Ottoman Empire, for those centuries, as long as you paid your taxes, you're good to go, right? You can make whatever you want out of yourself. However, as we inch closer and closer towards World War I, the empire declines, and I'm not going to get into the myriad of reasons that it declined. That's for another class entirely. But for various reasons, the empire starts to shrink, and the empire starts to decline and lose its strength, and people within the empire sense it. And so one of the very last sultans, right, their king, their emperor, if you will, that was ruling at the time, he was essentially overthrown or taken aside by a coup called the Young Turks. And so the coup happened because these young gentlemen, the Young Turks, it was a group of like a dozen or so of them, they were concerned that the entire empire was crumbling, it was going to collapse, which it was, and they wanted to do something about it. And at that time, right, they were at war on a number of sides. And so in a pitch type of moment, they start to order the systematic genocide and killing of the Armenians within the communities. The reason for this is because the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire had been at each other's throats for, decades. And at the time, they were hammering away at each other on the Eastern Front, right? Cannon fire, militaries, large armies, cavalry clashing, etc. And so a lot of the Armenians were actually joining the Russian side. Although, of course, not every single Armenian was in the Ottoman Empire was pro-Russia. And so the Young Turks kind of made a very blanket statement. All of the Armenians are bad, and we now need to mass exterminate them. And so upwards of 1.5 million of the Armenians were cleansed and exterminated through a variety of ways and reasons. Now, this happened over the course of a few years, from starting approximately from 1894 to 1915. And they were targeted because they were, number one, Armenians, they were two, Christians, number three, some of them were helping on the Eastern Front with the Russians, but a lot of this just comes down to kind of racist propaganda, right? You need a scapegoat. Just like the Ottoman Empire said, oh, look, the Armenians are the fault of the empire crumbling. It would be very similar to how later on Hitler would say, look, Germany crumbled because of the Jews. We have to kill them now. Very similar. And so the fact that a lot of the Armenians had to literally struggle to survive, and there's recorded events of like horrific stories of them surviving, right? These massacres. They ended up being a very pragmatic and survivalist type of people. And so as they get dispersed throughout the world, right, whoever was lucky enough to leave that situation, whether they ended up in the Middle East or Russia or Europe or the UK, South America, Australia, the United States, right? There's Armenians all over the world now. They still retained that knowledge that they are part of the diaspora. They are all part of the Armenian community. Many of them obviously were becoming integrated into the local countries, but still prided themselves to, go get an excellent education, go for the white-collar jobs, and because their culture was almost wiped out and destroyed, they wanted to retain their culture for as much as possible, and so they started to build like Armenian schools to teach their children and grandkids the Armenian language, right, and the culture, etc. And the Greek situation was very similar because the Greeks were also living in the Ottoman Empire at the time. And so the Ottomans were, although not exterminating them like the Armenians, the Ottomans were, obviously still very harsh towards the Greeks because Greece at that time was being kind of just pinched for money and taxes and very, harsh treatment by the Ottomans because the Ottomans were Muslim and the Greeks were famously, right, non-Muslim. So they were completely different religions, and some of that discrimination was proliferating. And so the Greeks also came very heavily to the United States, and many, many communities started to pop up from the Greek side. If any of you have seen, it's not probably the most relevant or historic movie ever, or like a documentary or anything, but My Big Fat Greek Wedding. right? I love that movie. It's so charming. And it shows that kind of very close-knit family unit, right, of the, Greek family. And so some of that, right, is kind of similar, right? Being proud of your heritage, your language, your culture, and especially, right, whenever the daughter or the husband or the daughter or the son wants to find a spouse and get married, it's like, you must marry a Greek, right? Or in Armenian culture too, you must marry an Armenian. Because if almost all of you were wiped out and uprooted from your home, right, from your homeland, you want to retain that culture, right, as much as possible. And so my own history, half of it, because I am half Russian, half Armenian, my Armenian side does have a pretty interesting history there. From my Armenian side going back, I believe it was my great-great-grandfather. He was part of the Russian cavalry, the Russian Imperial Guard, an Armenian. And once the genocide was taking place and he was fighting alongside the Russians, they were trying to beat back the Ottoman waves of troops going in and just shooting and killing everyone. And so famously, I don't know if the legend holds up, but this is what kind of proliferated in my family at the time. Famously, my great-grandfather came into one of the kind of barracks and had a huge bag filled with chopped off ears, right, off of the corpses that he had slain to defend a lot of the Armenians from the invading armies that were looting, burning, raping their way through the territory. And so the genocide has very long history in my family, and especially others. So especially because we live in Los Angeles as well, we have a very big Armenian community here in Glendale and other areas. So you'll definitely probably keep hearing about it for sure. And so families such as this would be living within the empire, calmly, peacefully, right? Having businesses or growing as the gentleman here, epic mustaches, right? Look at that thing. My goodness. Mario would be proud. But, you would have these, great family portraits, right? And good lives. You would be part of great music groups, right? The Armenian Pilgrim Orchestra, right? Some of them coming to the U.S. early, if they were lucky enough, before all of the, ultimate genocide started, but was still continuing. And so they started, having wonderful, orchestras and kind of extracurricular activities. But the very last Sultan, Mehmed V, that was in charge of the Ottoman Empire, he was not strong enough to maintain the traditional balance between all of the people of the empire. Because like I said, for hundreds of years, they were living peacefully side by side. It was a wonderful place. But he was not strong enough because the Young Turks, this radical revolutionary group that saw the country, essentially collapse, they wanted to do something very extreme to try to prevent that from happening. And that was one of their extreme measures. And so you saw some Armenian volunteer armies, right, form because they needed to start defending their communities as they started to see that the Ottoman armies that typically had been defending them were now going through village after village and slaughtering men, women, and children as much as they could see. And these are called the death marches. They would get all of these groups of individuals and start marching them through the desert. If they died along the way, great for them. If they did not die along the way, they ended up just shooting them and burying them in the sand. And so, although there is not as much evidence of the Armenian genocide because it was a little earlier in history, we do have some photographs here, especially a lot of oral interviews from survivors. Many years later, unfortunately, during the Jewish Holocaust under Hitler, I guess fortunately, right? Unfortunate that it of course happened, but fortunately technology was more advanced, and so a lot of the photographs and videos taken, it was much more solid proof, right, that the Holocaust had happened. Because even today, after 100 years, Turkey still denies that the genocide ever took place. And so horrible kind of scenes like this would be, at the forefront of the experience. And of course, after some time, various troops, whether they are British or Russian or anyone else, if they were moving through the area after World War I ended and after the Ottoman Empire was, quote unquote, defeated, we have reports of various soldiers kind of coming through and just finding just essentially graveyards, right? And so, it was tried to be, be covered up as much as possible, but the photographic evidence, the oral interviews, and everything else says otherwise. So, in Los Angeles during April, if you ever see all of the Armenians kind of rallying together, you'll know why. Here's a couple of interesting videos about the Armenian genocide. The one on the left-hand side is kind of a typical like National Geographic little overview of what the genocide was. A little bit on the sad side. It's only like 2-3 minutes long. I love the one on the right. So if any of you are a fan of System of a Down, it's more of like a metal band. One of their lead members, Serj Tankian, talks about the genocide in a very nice, poignant way with I believe he was with an Australian or New Zealand news reporter. And so he has a very just heart-to-heart conversation of like, oh, well, like I heard about all this from my grandparents and this, and it's part of my culture, etc. So a pretty interesting interview if you want to give it a watch. A nice little tribute to the Armenian genocide of 1915. So, kind of like what a modern family, right, was kind of doing for remembrance with art. This is within Los Angeles, actually. This is an attorney who works in Glendale, and he talks about his experiences in Los Angeles and kind of moving here and growing up within the community, etc. So a pretty cool and modern, like in-depth view of what, let's say, somebody coming and achieving within the Armenian community, went through. So a pretty cool look if you have the time to watch the interview. And with that, we are done with the chapter. So essentially for this time around, for chapter 5, we were discussing how folks were moving through Ellis Island, some of the reasons they were coming over, whether it was from Spain, Iberia, it was from Italy. Many of the Italians became Italian Americans, the Eastern Europeans, and then making a pit stop and focusing a little more on the Armenians because they were one of the diaspora groups. They were probably the most affected by the Ottoman Empire, and so we ended it on that front. But that is the end of the chapter for new immigrants, and we're going to be focusing on many other kind of different topics as the class moves on. And the next chapter, for chapter 6, is going to be the American Jewish community. So stay tuned for the next one, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for watching.